let's start with subjective and objective value. We're basically trying to talk about the concept of value and worth in a capitalist society, given what we're seeing with non-fungible tokens, with the rise of cryptocurrency. Why is Bitcoin worth $60,000?
Yes.
Where does this value come from? Because as we all know, Bitcoins were like the consolation prize at video game competitions and things like this. You see all these funny memes. So in order to get there, we need to talk about what value is in the first place.
Yes.
And so there's subjective value and there's objective value. So maybe that's a great place to start.
Yeah, and I would say objective value is a particularly philosophical notion, right? An objective value would be something like a human right, or the right to water, or human needs. Right, so
which is already being subjectivized.
Which is also being subjectivized, and I think that's something that we should get to when we talk about subjective value. But it is based on the notion that in humanity and in nature there are certain determinate things, determinate ideas, determinate objects that are required for human existence and the existence of the world. Like, I would say the green movement, right, and the move against climate change is one arguing about an objective value, a philosophically objective value.
Mm-hmm.
Now, obviously, this has been subjectivized as well, but this would be an objective value. Whereas a subjective value is a term that's used in a particular way in economics, and particularly in market economics, which is to say that on the philosophical side, people's tastes, beliefs, desires are relative. That, one person could enjoy a wine and be willing to pay $10,000 for it,
right,
while another person would have absolutely no interest in that. But
another person may be sober and not even drink wine.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
And that's it having zero value to their subjective person.
Yes, and so what we have ultimately is a market where at variable rates, commodities are defined by a variable value that can go up and down based on supply and demand, right? And things like baseball cards, wines, limited release clothing, things that we come to define with like elite branding and lifestyle. Those are kind of like the pinnacle of subjective value, while we don't really think about the subjective value of a can opener. They're just $5.99 everywhere. However, that has been determined based upon how many can openers are sold, the materials that go into the can opener, and the cost to the company, right?
The cost of labor production it takes to make said can opener.
And then how far can we push that value above that initial cost that people will be willing to still buy this thing?
Mm-hmm.
And so there is where the subjective aspect comes, where most people, I think, inherently, because we live in a capitalist society, take it as objective. Oh, this thing just cost $15 to buy this action figure for my kid, and it will always cost that. And the steadiness of that is something that's illusory and, as Marx would say, reified.
Right. I'm just thinking of Lucille Bluth, R.I.P. What could a banana cost, Michael? $10? But of course, in speaking of Marx, this leads us to these kind of sister terms that are also really important for establishing value. And for Marx, he defined them as use value and exchange value. And this is sort of the transition point, the Rubicon between pre-capitalist and capitalist societies, where, in the good old days, heavy, air quotes, things had a use value. So a tool has a use. So its value is in how useful it is to you in your survival, in your day-to-day lives. Having shoes made had a use because it protects your feet, it allows you to do more work. But with the advent of capitalism, we shift from an economic system where something's value, something's worth, is no longer defined by the use it can provide for any of us, right?
Yes.
But then there all of a sudden becomes an exchange value as well. That certain products, certain objects, and this is where we start getting into things like art. But in Marx's sense, he's speaking more of like capital, and by capital I mean like machinery and factories and things like this, that have an inherent value of an exchange, that they have a value that is worth something that someone will pay you for. And all of a sudden, the way that we value things becomes this exchange value. So to use this can opener example again, right? A can opener is what, like $5 at the store. But I can't sell you my can opener. My can opener is no longer worth $5. So the point I'm trying to make is what we see in this exchange value is that things no longer have a stable value because of their usefulness, right? I could have a can opener that I've never used, but as soon as it leaves the store, it's no longer worth the $5.99 or whatever the price tag says it is,
Yes.
right? And so what capitalism does is it starts thwarting the way we value things, because we're starting to value them by what their exchange value is, what I can get from it. Because again, and this is sort of reductionary, but we're no longer in a barter system. It's not, well, my sack of flour is worth so much to you, and your wagon wheel that you make is worth so much to me, and so there's a trade that seems valuable. We're much more concerned about what is a given object's what it's worth in exchange, right?
Yeah, and I would say before we go on to Marx's counter argument to this and what he determined as truly being objective value, it's important to show you also defined exactly what fungibility and non-fungibility are, right? So
this is, of course, important to our conversation because we will talk about NFTs, non-fungible tokens, which you probably heard in the news, and is all the rage.
Is related to Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies in general, and it's brought up a lot of interesting topics about value. So, what the fungible is what can simply be exchanged. $1 is equal to another dollar. It can be exchanged. And to a larger extent, various commodities can be exchanged for a certain amount of dollars, or a certain amount of X commodity can be traded for another commodity, or a certain amount of money can be equivalent to a contract, right? Whereas the non-fungible would be like their can opener now being your can opener, your cat is your cat, right? And you could find the same breed of cat, right? And it could be identical in age,
right?
But you are not going to trade the cat, right? And this works to some extent in commodities. For instance, what we talked about earlier, a baseball card, right, has value to a person, right, where it can become non-fungible, right? Its value is inherent. Or in a more tradable commodity, you could talk about a ticket, right, say a plane ticket. You are going to fly, they're all tickets, they're all pieces of paper, but one is in the aisle seat and one's in the middle seat, and one is first class, and one has your name on it. And all of these things change the value of that thing. so it becomes non-fungible. Now, that isn't entirely the case because, yeah, you can turn in your ticket and get a refund in some cases.
Right.
But there are, in capitalist theory, objects in society on a scale of degree that range from the fungible to the non-fungible.
So would you put kind of sentimental objects, like I'm thinking of, right, well, whatever that famous movie is that I'm going to ruin the end of, but Rosebud, right? The sled is his childhood, treasured childhood possession.
Citizen Kane.
Citizen Kane, of course. But these kind of sentimental objects, would you include this as like a non-fungible value, something that its value doesn't diminish or it cannot be equated, shall we say, because it only has that value to me, much like my cat,
yes,
right? My fish.
And very ironically, this immutability of the value is the most subjective value possible, right? Despite it being separated from the subjective valuation of products based on their value in the market, the non-fungible asset often is something that is completely subjectively oriented and determined by the history, the life history of a person, right? So that's what makes much of this very fascinating, right? When we talk about Bitcoin and Ethereum, which is where tokenization comes in.
And there's I always think a very interesting wrinkle happens at this point when you're looking at these sort of subjective values for, I'll just use like a baseball card or something for example. But what sort of starts to be the barometer of their value becomes, of course, the rarity of things, right? So if you're thinking of baseball cards or something like Michael Jordan's, I think it's a Flair card or Fleer, I don't remember which brand made it. His rookie card, which isn't even his rookie card because I think it's an 86 card.
Yeah.
But they, nobody really gave much value to basketball cards at all at that time. And so there were very few of them made and even less of them made it out of the 80s in any kind of reasonable shape that a collector might find valuable.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting to note how much this rarity and this desirability and something that is unique plays in these conversations because it shouldn't necessarily change how we value something just because there's one of them. And particularly with non-fungible tokens, this seems to be the idea where it's like you've got this tomahawk jam clip of LeBron James that gets sold for X of tens of thousands of dollars, despite the fact that you or I could bring it up on our phone and watch it right now.
Yeah. In 4K.
In 4K, right. But it becomes this idea that only one person can own this. And it is mine. And so, and you see echoes of this, right, in the whole history of objects possessing value, whether that be jade or gold or these precious stones, or in a great example is like lapis lazuli, which in ancient times had a great value placed on it, even though today we could just go to the store and pick some up for like $4, like a nice little slab. But in Roman times and even beyond that, since it could only be sourced from a very specific location, it had this high value because it was perceived as something that there was only so much of.
Right? Yeah, and this also leads into what we were going towards before, which is Marx's theory of value, right? And what I think are the strengths of it and the weaknesses of it, right? Now, the strength, which is, I think, the overriding factor for the longevity and perpetuity of Marx, is that it values human beings. What it says is that the value of an object is equivalent to the work put into it, the work hours that are put into it, right? And of course, he understood the interaction of industrial machinery in this process, but inevitably, what he was trying to do was to say, instead of having these things be all subjectively determined by our varying subjective perspectives, that we can instead normalize, based on human need, value by equating it to how long it takes to be produced and the work that goes into it. And that in doing so, this would invest interest in the worker to their own work.
Right.
I.e., the concept of alienation, that in capitalism we are completely untied to our work because we have no relationship to its value, and therefore psychologically and actually separate ourselves, our work time and our home time. Right?
Well, yeah, and oftentimes even are alienated from the final product itself. If you work in a assembly line, you only connect widget A to widget B,
yes,
but you never actually see the final product. And speaking of, I think one of the things that's so valuable about Marx's theory of value is this isolation of actually the most non-fungible piece of value of them all, which is the value of my day.
Yes.
The value of my day is worth so much more to me than to anyone else.
Yeah.
And in a way, what he's trying to do is recognize that element, and it kind of brings this humanity, this very human element into this idea of value that really that it's all based on the most non-fungible elements of it all, which is our time.
Yeah, well, all I was going to comment on that is he found the true non-fungibility, which is life, right?
Yeah, go figure.
And in capitalism, that is not something that is extremely valued. It may be valued at the most elite levels of finance or of wealth, where people get to have, a mansion off in this place and a mansion off in that place, and gets to actually spend time with themselves. But in capitalist society, our time is increasingly truncated, and that time is then also commodified, right? So that we go on vacations, and the vacation is to a specific branded place,
yeah.
And you spend, you buy trinkets and things that you may not need at all, right? And this becomes normalized, whereas things could be a different way.
Right. I mean, and even to an extent, where we're at in capitalism, and some might argue even since the 50s, right, is that this most valuable, this most non-fungible value in our lives, our life, is now actually being sold back to us. And whether that's in the form of a vacation at Sandals Resort, whatever those things are, right?
A visit to Sybaris.
Right. Yeah, cue music. But it's actually sold back to us. One of the more fascinating things that I've done, I was in a class on it. It's called Urbanization and Its Discontents, and I was looking at real estate. I was very interested in how, specifically condos and luxury apartments get branded, because, as in many cities around the country that I've been to, Chicago has seen this rash of these high-rise developments go up. But the whole face of the real estate business looks like this, where they're no longer trying to sell you a house with feature X, Y, or Z, although these are important parts of their sales tactic. But what they're trying to sell you is the idea of home, the idea of happiness. And you see this not only in, let's say, the real estate business, which are hilarious because you can drive around Chicago and see these ads where it's like, buy laughter, and it's like a family in an apartment laughing together. And, obviously you don't actually buy happiness or laughter when you buy a condo, but you see it in all kinds of, whether it's the streaming service or, toilet paper, right? The Charmin bears and everything, where really what they're selling you is this idea of family and vulnerability and comfortability. And so, our actual most subjective value has been so alienated from us that what capitalism likes to do is try and sell it back to us through its commodities that it sells. Every car commercial, right? What are they selling you? It's a safe family.
I would say the most recent amazing capitulation of our reality into a car commercial is a recent, I don't know the brand, but it was LeBron James talking about revolution, right? And what it means to be revolutionary.
The real revolutionaries, the ones that change the game forever, understand that strength is never enough. Evolving, imagining, seeing the world not as it is, but how it could be. That's how true greatness is realized. That is how you change the world.
So even the opposite of capitalism, the imagination of a revolution against capitalism, can be transformed into something that can be consumed in the form of this revolutionary SUV.
Revolutionary SUV, wow.
Yeah.
And this is what capitalism does, right? It expropriates anything, any virus, anything that fights against it, right? And so, no disrespect to LeBron James, I think he's a fine human being.
Yes.
He's a hell of a basketball player.
Yeah.
But he's not a revolutionary.
No.
And he can, and as he should, stand up for causes like Black Lives Matter and everything else that's going on in this world. But even the mere act of him speaking out for something like that subjugates it.
Yes.
It takes something that should be against the system, against capitalism, and it only becomes this, assumed by capitalism.
Yes.
It becomes commodified by capitalism.
Yeah, it becomes a superficial affect. Now then, when we talk about revolution, we're referring to the angry posts on social media rather than a truly revolutionary act. Now, one thing that I do think is questionable about Marx's theory of value is his absolute distinction between subjective and objective value, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because clearly, if you think about how do generally people live, there is this distinction. It's quite apparent. However, whenever humans were given the opportunity to have leisure, all of a sudden, those aspects of subjective value came in. Who had the fancy pommel on their sword?
Right.
The queens that owned 1,000 Russian blues or whatever, like these things happened in the aristocracy, and that quality of human thinking seems like it may be a natural aspect, something that needs to be curbed so that we can have a better society, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not simply that the system is doing this to us, but that there may be a functional value within human beings due to their subjectivity and due to that the connection to some object that only matters to us, right? That does negatively affect the collective, right?
Right.
And I think, this is something that we will see bear out in the question of non-fungible tokens.
I think so, and because in some ways a lot of what it comes down to, and what you're in many ways hinting at can be not totally encapsulated by this, but there's this question of beauty in there, right? So whether you want to talk about like the original monetary exchange, gold, or something as ephemeral as the tulip bubble in Holland in the 1600s, there is a question of these things that have an appeal to something that I think exists outside of certainly Marx's conception of value, and he kind of inherits this from the Enlightenment, where all the Enlightenment thinkers are so knee-jerk away from this kind of subjectivity of like seeing oracles and this
the mysticism,
right, this totally unreasoned way of being, which of course is where beauty finds itself, in this unreasoned way, because you cannot, despite how many times people have tried, you cannot reason beauty and what the beholder finds beautiful, right? And so I think this is one of these like rogue concepts that like really mushes up both capitalism, but as well as Marxism, where it's impossible to pin down anywhere because it is so subjective.
Yes,
and it is not only so subjective but so powerful on our lives, And even if like we were talking about basketball cards before, like even that, like people may find a coveted card that has, sometimes they have those like jersey swatches on
jersey
them.
swatches and signatures and
right, and one of those jersey swatches might just be better than all the rest for no ascertainable reason.
Yes,
but just something that
is
conjures,
intuited,
right? This like warm feeling that is really hard to pin down anywhere.
In a Kantian sense, it's almost like it comes from that creative aspect that he talks about in the mind,
Yeah, the imagination.
Before, the imagination,
yeah.
Before the understanding, and that kind of gray space, which we have gotten to in our podcast pretty deeply, I think is an aspect here.
Well, yeah, and I would say, for me, like the biggest critique against Kant's, and if you've been following along with those episodes, is the one thing he misses is that a priori sense, and it goes beyond beauty, right? But whether it's laughter or crying, right? Like there is this sort of a priori emotionalism that is really hard for metaphysics or any other kind of system of logic to make sense of, because it's so elusive, and right, it's ethereal, because it's also not theological, right? It has no, there's not really a connection to God or creation or cause and effect. Why are we here, right? It's just this very enchanting feeling.
Yeah, and he would try to understand it in critique of judgment, or critique.
I think it's critique of judgment, because that's where it goes into aesthetics, really.
Yes, in the sublime. He tries to get at it,
Bingo.
but he never really quite gets there. Maybe another time we should actually look at that section on the sublime as an extension of this. But I think we can quickly pivot into the NFTs and how they kind of represent an expansion of this problem.
Right, and I think so, because we've seen these crazy things like GIFs and what have you get sold as NFTs for these insane amounts of money. And for me, especially being someone who got their BFA in art school, I got my MA in art history. I know, make fun of me, it's totally fine. But of course, what it mirrors to me is the art world, right?
Yes.
Where you've got these very subjective things that through these kind of like archival bookkeeping of provenance, plus the general agreement of people with power and privilege, certain things are valued much more than other things.
Yes.
Even though they're both, say, paintings, right?
Yes.
And one could argue the merit or quality of said paintings, right?
Yeah, of course.
or like there was a recent scandal where there was somebody forging Mark Rothko's, which are these like two color field paintings of like two color fields, where they a specific painting was seen as a great example of his work, even though it was forged 70 years later.
And wasn't this by someone who didn't even know they were forged?
Yeah.
Yes.
And subjectively, or objectively rather, shouldn't these things be worth the same if they're accomplishing the same sort of mode of expression? But of course they are not, because one is a Rothko and one is not.
And one is not. Within the underlying technology of what we're talking about comes different theories of value, right? So, when we talk about Bitcoin, we're talking about a simple system, right? Mm-hmm. It's a simple system of transactions. And, it's created through the blockchain. Blockchain is a network of computers that are solving algorithmic puzzles. And so to solve one of those algorithmic puzzles, you mine a coin. And these coins are produced up till a limit, 21 million. And there are 17 million out there. And they make it harder and harder to do so, right? So in the original form, it was trying to avoid an aspect of capitalism, which is inflation, right? So if we can have something that is a set system, the data within it is all transparent, the algorithm protects it from being changed. This does seem at face value as like a step up from your normal bank, right, or your normal market institutions, which have all of this data and information which is withheld from the public. And so the public do not know exactly how they are getting value from this or that stock, or what is the actual value of this or that house that they use their money on, right? So you'd be able to make these exchanges. And then with Ethereum, where the tokenization process comes from.
And so these are like the two big crypto coins, if you're not
for the last
following.
For the last couple of years, these two have been the top two in the market.
Yeah, Bitcoin hovers around 60K for a Bitcoin right now. I think Ethereum is in the 2,000 range, whether it's a little above or a little below.
Yes. And Ethereum is there are far more of them. There are way more Ethereum coins. So you have that aspect with Bitcoin. Now with Ethereum and tokenization, and how tokenization is produced, is Ethereum didn't want to be a peer-to-peer transactional system. It wanted to be like a fuel for different modes of transactions. It wanted to be able to create a supercomputer that would be able to manage all of these different transactions and be what is called Turing complete. That means, completely passing the Turing test and being almost human-like in its, functions as a bank, as a stock institution, etc., right? And that allowed for varying protocols, and those protocols included the ability to tokenize. So instead of mining, you mint, right? Mm-hmm. And instead of it being large groups who create big computers, they randomized the process and made it harder for computers specific to mining to mint these new tokens. And that allowed for what they perceived as a lower energy and more egalitarian way of people creating wealth.
Right.
But
I was just going to say, and I think it's important to acknowledge too, with like these terms we're using, right? Because even our language is a value creator, right? And so, starting with Bitcoin, it is this peer-to-peer created blockchain, and of course, we're getting value from the Napster age. This is birthed by the creation of Napster, of LimeWire, of all these peer-to-peer services where content is being decentralized from Time Warner, from Universal, from these like big corporations.
And before you continue, blockchain itself was created simply to combat spam email, and so it initially had a very corporate function, from the start. But anyway,
AT&T needs to get that blockchain with all these spam calls, but the point being, so it's taking value on one hand that's kind of very radical and revolutionary, the decentralization of a monetary system where it does not have to be attached to the state. And this is what made it so appealing in its early days, and why, of course, the earliest adopters were, hackers for a lark.
Yeah.
But particularly if you're conversing with people across continents, let alone countries, where, all of a sudden you don't have to deal with a currency or two different currencies and whatever their exchange rate may be. It's just one currency that you both use. But of course, with Silk Road, with, kind of underground drug markets and things like that, it becomes very enticing because there's no sort of government control, so it's one less level you might get, thrown in jail or have a case brought against you.
It became a means of funding insurgencies around the world,
And so, as far as like a revolutionary potential, all of a sudden that in its onset was actually very high. And I think, I have a friend who, he bought a giant building because, very early on he got a bunch of Bitcoin. He was a hacker, he was a programmer, and it became this like enticing thing that you could use for maybe nefarious purposes, but also if you aligned yourself with a kind of anti-state ethos, became an interesting thing to acquire.
Yeah.
But then, a step further as far as building value through content, through our language, right? It's still modeling itself after these very capitalist or even feudal forms of production, right? We're mining the Bitcoin, and what does mining conjure up but hard labor? Lots of people being underpaid to create this thing. And I'm not saying that is necessarily the way that Bitcoin gets mined, but by trying to bring validity to what it is, by this currency has a basis for having a value because it's sort of being emulating the old forms of mining precious stones and minerals, that there is some way that the human intellect can grasp onto that and be like, yes, I can accept that a Bitcoin, which is something that isn't real, there's no coin that comes with a Bitcoin, can have value.
Yeah.
I can project value onto this because it is based on a system that I know also produces ontological value, shall we say, right? Which leads to what you were talking about with the massive effect that it has on the environment, right?
Yes. Well, in the end, Bitcoin's only way of making it so that it can limit the amount of coins that are mined is to make it more difficult, and therefore you need bigger computers. And what were developed are something called ASICs, which are more powerful than a GPU, a graphics processor, or a CPU. And so people would just get tons of these, and they would use them to mine as much as they could. And what happened was, now only about 5 or 6 groups have gotten together, and they control a large portion of the Bitcoin market, right? And this seems to contradict the initial values of what blockchain technology was supposed to do, right? And it consumes an immense amount of energy. And so Ethereum, now before I continue, this is based on a simple distinction. So how Bitcoin functions is proof of work. simply meaning that every time you have the information that's produced by one of these algorithms, it is checked, validated, put in the system for good, and cannot be changed, right? And so Ethereum wants to change that to proof of stake. And so how they did this was they made it so that GPUs and CPUs could have an effect and actually mine it. And they randomized, to some extent, the process of being able to mint as validators. Now you see the change in language, right? These new coins. And so this was part of their concept of a fuel, of a massive virtual computer, a thing that everyone could access. But still, at bottom, the way that you can even get in is to use the code on your blockchain is you have to put some money down, right? And the more money you put down, the higher in the randomization process it is that you can get picked. It does take less energy, but it still has a hierarchical system that starts to represent even more complex capitalist functions, right? So
yeah, it's like reproducing these systems of privilege, sure, but of hierarchy.
Of hierarchy,
Yeah.
yes. And so, it's quite interesting to look at, because when you think about the token, just that concept in and of itself, and what it has produced, there have been some good things. I think that the idea that a virtual artist can find a way to get paid and find a way to market themselves is a relatively good thing, as Byzantine as the art market is. But at the same time, it has opened up the ability for brands to now manipulate digital space so that they can, for instance, there was one of the Paul brothers sold a piece of art and like a bunch of tokens to access that piece of art and made $3 million, right? And that's completely off of brand value. And so ultimately, despite its ideal, mission, what it inevitably does is just create a way for virtual objects that cannot be copied or sold as various commodities. And in the future, let's say a video game or a phone app buys into this, then suddenly people will be able to go and take whatever they get from the app or whatever they get from the video game and resell that at a higher value, and then allow for the company to sell that at a higher value, because then suddenly it gains this non-fungible quality. And what have we seen in the non-fungible quality in capitalism? It's based on rarity, right? It's based on this highly subjective perspective. And so what we failed to mention is that in all of this, they believe that they have solved the problem of value in an objective way. But in fact, it's almost the opposite, that they have objectified subjectivization.
Right.
They've objectified the subjective. You have all of these objects which are meaningless to 99% of the world, right? The LeBron video, how much would the majority of the world pay for it when they can go and watch it on YouTube? For free. But now we can commodify and monetize anything as long as there's one person out there willing to pay $100,000 for that video clip.
Right, and this does really represent the monolith that is capitalism, right? That it just subsumes everything in its path, even if what it's subsuming is antagonistic towards it in the first place. And of course, we're talking about Bitcoin as in its very early life being very valuable to sort of like people against the state or people operating outside of sort of respected society, right? But of course, who does that also appeal to? It appeals to the capitalists themselves, who are always looking for another avenue in which to hide their money.
Yes.
And so, in that process, of course, all of a sudden, these like Bitcoin starts because was it even a year ago, 2 years ago? It was $12,000 for Bitcoin.
Well, you had this 2017 bubble where it reached like $12,000, $13,000. Then it fell, and everybody said, "Oh, it's done," and then it just went right back up.
And so now what you're seeing is, I mean, certainly another bubble. It has all the attributes and characteristics of one, but it is, and I think we were talking about this earlier when we were getting ready for this episode, but it becomes the reification of exchange value, where the value of, say, a Bitcoin or an NFT or of Ethereum is solely its exchange value. It has no objective. It is not an object that can have any value. It's just this concept that we're assigning value to, right? I have a Bitcoin, so that's worth this amount of value. But and Bitcoin does have, right, people do buy things with it, although not to the extent that anyone buys anything with like actual fiat currency.
Yeah.
It becomes this speculative game of exchange value, and it almost becomes not worth what the exchange value is, but what the exchange value's potential is.
Yes.
And so of course you hear people talk about how highly volatile the crypto markets are, and the reason for this it is the reification of even exchange value. It's capitalism taking exchange value one step further, right? Where it has no objective value, actually. It's not an accepted currency in any country. It's just accepted because we all agree
that we will, exchange for it.
Right.
But and this brings up, I think, at its end point, two different sides, and I'll bring up the first, which is kind of like the regressive conservative perspective on it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for instance, there was an interview with Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, right? Warren Buffett calls it rat poison. This is back when it's worth like $1,000 or something like that. And Bill Gates, he says, "Oh, it's a marvelous technology, but it can't be controlled by the government." Then later he's asked about it, and he says, "I would have to short it because it has no inherent value." Now, what I think is an interesting possibility is if, conceptually, those that use Bitcoin, and particularly leftists that explain Bitcoin, are able to demonstrate the lack of actual value of the dollar, or even of gold, like the libertarians want us to go back to the gold standard, right? Like,
which also inherently has no value.
Which inherently has no value. If this, in an abstract way, in a difficult way, could demystify to some degree, the process by which we buy and sell things.
The abstractness of it too.
Yes.
Right? Because I admittedly just said gold has no inherent value, but it does, right? It's useful in making electronics.
Yeah.
Because of its malleability, it is actually very good at making jewelry. There's a reason people make jewelry out of it. It's that its qualities are very good for that task. But obviously, and you bring up the libertarians wanting to go back to the gold standard as that, like, we're basing our currency off of something real, which has a perceived actual value, where obviously, if I pulled out a dollar bill, sure, it's worth $1 to you and me, but, the paper isn't worth $1. And the paper might actually be worth more than $1 with all the bells and whistles they have in it now.
Who knows?
But it's just a standard that we all agree that a little green piece of paper with Andrew Jackson on it is worth $20.
Yeah.
$20 means something to you and I, right? And so, I think there is an opportunity there, especially as radicals or leftists, of revealing I don't want to say the fallacy, but the phantasmagoria of
Yes.
money. That it
To
is
truly use Marxist words.
right. The that it is just smoke and mirrors, and sure it is like a cultural politeness, something that we all accept. You know, if you sneeze, I will say gesundheit or something, or God bless you, or you know. And so, right, there is there room then to reveal the smoke and mirrors by utilizing these currencies that kind of circumvent this, right?
And earlier in the second half of what I wanted to proposition you relates to some extent to what we were talking about earlier, which is this idea of luxury communism, right? Right, which is a hilarious idea. And essentially, you could probably explain it better than I. I'll take a stab at it. It is that if we could automate everything, we could all live in a workless society with all kinds of wonderful things that would be essentially given to us because everything would be so low cost. And in fact,
because we've enslaved the robots.
yes. But in fact, Marx did actually write this out in a fragment that if automation were to reach a point where we were essentially just its caregivers, we were its overwatch, that labor value would cease to be the measure of value, right? And so, while I find that to be ridiculous, as you do as well, there will be a point at which automation comes to greatly diminish work value as being a potential objective measure for the left. And so I do wonder if the idea of a universal, non-state, non-corporate, non-institutional currency that develops from this technology, but with a different standard of rules, a truly communal standard of rules, could, in fact, be a tool for a future socialism.
I mean, you would think it has to be, but the question, of course, is though, what are those rules, right?
Yes.
You know, because to take 2 steps back to try and get 3 steps forward, you know, you mentioned kind of what Marx talks about when he talks about automation, and which is sort of the like trap door in which, you know, fully automated luxury communism was written under the auspices that, you know, if everything becomes automated, then, you know, all of a sudden we're free from work time, and that, you know, you would then have to establish some kind of UBI and truly create this sort of communist society where kind of everyone is given equal privilege, right? If everybody gets the same amount of money, then kind of we're all on the same level, right? But that's only, of course, like a part of Marx's incredibly broad writings and thoughts. And one of the things that I always think of is that Marx also is able to identify the value in something made by hand, right?
Yes.
That as soon as we start automating things or using technology to create products faster and thus decrease the value, right, the cost that we would have to pay for something,
And also increase the obsolescence.
right? But in doing so, we actually wind up making inferior products.
Yeah.
And he would argue this from a really like tactile level, right? That there's something about human care and cognition that can produce, he would argue, more beautiful, but certainly tools that work better, that function better for us. And in a way, I think you could also even include Benjamin's idea of an aura in his essay, Age of Mechanical Reproduction, where, you know, if right, so the Mona Lisa, right, has some kind of value. We'll just take that for granted,
Yes.
although we could argue about that, I would say. But what kind of value does, you know, you can photograph the Mona Lisa, you can make 10,000 copies of it, which will never have the same value as the actual thing. And you could hire somebody to copy the painting and use the same paints, but it will still, as we were talking about, not have still the same value of the original in some aspect.
Once realized.
Right. But in a way, I think that can almost be applied to what Marx is sort of saying when you make something by hand, that there is kind of a transference of aura into the object, right? And this is a very long way of saying, that's very interesting, because obviously when we're talking about cryptocurrencies and these things that are entirely automated, even if people are setting up their computers to mine these things so they get to claim them as their own, we have immediately departed from that. So we are in this kind of like automated area where some would argue, like, maybe we could find this fully automated luxury communism. But I think that also misses, how do you get from where we are at point A to this, utopic point Z, right? Which it does not seem like that path would be very productive.
I agree with you insofar as the end is utopian, right? If the idea is that we are going to produce this place where everybody is going to enjoy massive houses and all of these great pieces of technology and so on, then it's a complete absurdity, right? However, I wonder, in a more practical future, where most products are automated and the production of the machinery is automated, and that it goes very far back in the chain before you get real, like, human technicality. Gets down to the chips, the microchips, and things of that sort. And most people are working jobs where they are not in production, and we have the choice between national currencies, right, or various decentered currencies. Would it be possible for like-minded leftists to create their own blockchain? Because these blockchains are not all unitary, right? And define their own rules for how they were going to transfer value, right? And in some sense, subvert the market. This would not create a socialist state, but it would aid, theoretically, in helping other socialists.
Well, and I think the question too with that is like how these credits are earned, right? And I think that's the biggest question, because for as much as wrong with Bitcoin, right, the incredible amount of energy it takes. I've heard crazy things where it's like, the amount of energy being spent on mining Bitcoin is greater than that of like Venezuela or Argentina or something. I can't remember the country, but which is obviously not great. But even with this very kind of radical, decentralized goal as an endpoint, the problem, of course, is that it takes a certain amount of income to develop these machines to mine them. So again, the hierarchy we were talking about before, or their exchange value, which is now incredibly inflated. I could buy, like, I think they're called Satoris, the smallest unit of a Bitcoin.
Yeah.
But I don't have $60,000 to buy a Bitcoin, right?
Yeah.
And so it becomes on how the question, I think, becomes changing the way in which these things can be earned. Because right now, all cryptos, if you go to like crypto communities on like Reddit or something, they kind of laugh at fiat. It's the catch-all term for real currency. And, because they're having fun and they're all heavily invested in whatever their altcoin preference is. But the problem is still that in order to acquire whatever altcoin that is that they wish to purchase, it is still an exchange rate, right?
Yes.
And it's not earned in any way that goes back to these original non-fungible components of value, which is like the air we breathe, or water, or the right to be happy, right?
Well, let's think of the differences, for instance, between Ethereum and Bitcoin very quickly.
Sure.
So, Bitcoin, it requires huge amounts of computer power to mine. To mint in Ethereum, it takes less money and far less computer power. Now, say you didn't have to put down money, and it had a truly randomized process. Furthermore, in all of these blockchain systems, they have a centralized authority, right, that through the whole blockchain decides whether or not to change rules. They call them forks, right? Now, if that group, this blockchain, was left-oriented, and it could say, that movement or that activity, we would like to put value of this blockchain towards that, rather than it being the mining being a means towards a personal gain, right? That the mining was done randomly. It was using as much CPU, GPU power, and ASIC power as it can, but maybe avoiding that because of the energy concerns. And it tried to use whatever wealth it could to better the world.
Right.
Would this be a valuable end, or is it just something that is so opposite the basic thinking of the machinery that it's an impossibility?
Well, and I think that's the fundamental question, because, in you kind of just like very calmly describing the process and through a conversation of just monetary function, because like even say, right, like say we were able to do this with Ethereum, or say we created a new coin, and the first act of creation was that every single human being on the planet gets the same amount, right? But of course the problem with any kind of monetary system is that it's always built on, it's a system of scarcity, right? And so even if we all disseminate, say there's, a specific amount only, and there can never be any more made, and everybody gets 600 of these tokens or whatever, as soon as they enter into exchange, you start developing those hierarchies or those class systems where some people acquire more and some people acquire less.
Or someone uses it for the right end and one doesn't.
Right, and then of course you have, your Diogenes out there who are just jerking off in their bathtub in the rain saying like, you're all fools, I've never even touched my 600 coins, I don't know where they are. And so let me throw this at you. And so my kind of theory right now with where we are in like capitalism is the goal, or like the operating procedure of capitalism, is it tries to devalue as much as it can the actual important things in life. So whether that's the relationship you have with your parents, or an abstract concept like love, or conversely, if something is more real and less abstract, like water, where it's something that we have forever considered a human right, you have the right to water, and not to say people haven't died of thirst before, but generally it's something that, if you were a traveler and you asked someone for water, you would give them water. It has no exchange value because it's just water.
It wasn't like Palestine and Israel, for instance.
Right. And so what capitalism tries to do is it tries to devalue the things which fundamentally have the highest value in our lives. Things like love, things like loyalty, things like, these like strong sort of building blocks of culture and relationships. Because it needs to devalue them to make its commodities, which are oftentimes trash, really, it's kitsch, seem valuable, seem enticing, seem desirable. That the only way you create desirability, as Marx would say, is developing this alienation, our alienation from both our labor power, but also from our humanhood. And in trying to replace what has been taken from us, it creates things like, sneakers being valuable because, if I get the newest kicks, then my identity will be one as someone who's cool and able to acquire these things and give me value.
The Birkin bag, the red bottom shoes.
Yeah. You're. I was just watching Sex and the City. What are those? The Manola Blanc. Whatever those shoes are, right? And so like we're essentially trying to buy back, our personal value through these commodities which has been stolen from us. And so I think I throw this at you in the question of like, is there a way to create, because barter very early on turns to these coinage exchanges,
yes.
right? Because it's, very difficult to be like, well, I've got 40 bushels of apples and now I need all these other things, well, you might not want apples, it's very cumbersome. But how, how can a altcoin or crypto or something like this, reestablish the abstract value that we actually have in things?
Well,
does that even make sense?
No, it does make sense. And I'll respond to it with a couple final claims about the Marxist project and how it has extended into the world. And we talked about this earlier. How I see it as what has been the result, the primary result of the Marxist project in action, or at least theoretically in action, what people call for are revolutions, right? Mm-hmm. And parties.
Right.
And so...
Not the fun kind of party.
Yeah. Now, throughout what we call still the first world, which means the non-communist world, but now is the only world.
Yeah.
Right. There is no substantial means of party. There is no substantial means of revolution. And I am not making an accelerationist argument as if we can turn the wheels of capitalism to make capitalism collapse.
Right, we're all bourgeois subjects,
yes.
Right? At this point, I mean, you could argue that there are maybe some proletariat left in America, but primarily we're all bourgeois subjects.
And if we were to add a third, there is this egalitarian pre-Marxist socialist tendency to say, let's just go back to the land. But I don't think that is possible either.
Right.
These can be done in pockets. These can be done in particular spaces. Maybe a particular country has the opportunity of a socialist leader. Maybe a particular country can have a revolution because of the weakness of its government. And maybe in small pockets we can have workers' communes, and we can have a reduction of energy use and a collective production by people living together. But I also believe that this is the time, so I cannot give you a certain answer, but this is the time for thinking, right? This is the time for thinking about these technologies, about these possibilities, and how they can be used for the left, right? And when I say left, I mean socialism, right? And if there is some possibility, because all of these cryptocurrencies, at least the major ones, they started with white papers talking about how can we use blockchain technology and protocols in blockchain technology to either produce something or improve on something or allow a new function. Well, should we be thinking about a socialist functionality for this thing that clearly produces value? Because I do believe, A, subjective value isn't going anywhere, that there is some bit of subjective value that it will always be there, and B, because these systems are going to disseminate, right? These systems are not going to disappear, and so we can either leave them to the wolves, or we can try to think it out, try to theorize, try to take this moment in which there is no revolution to produce something different. And so, I guess in a vague way, that's the only answer I can really give to you.
But it's a smart answer because, I really cling on to you say, well, there is no revolution. And I always think, while there is no revolution, where can we be, where can you revolutionize revolution?
Yeah.
Revolution does not have to look like, storming the Bastille.
Yes, let me make an addendum. When I say there is no revolution, there is no, Luxembourg, and the Orange Revolution. There is no, storming the Bastille. Like these different revolutions that happened in the 19th and early to mid 20th century have become dominated by the military-industrial complex. That's my point. Simply.
Right. Yeah, and it's like, I think, kind of closing, I like, this whole time I've been thinking of, what is the Voltaire book? Is it Candide? Where they're in this, he's in this civilization far away from his own. And their streets are paved with gold. And he's freaking out. And they're like, dude, what is your problem? Because in this civilization they have an abundance of gold. It's worthless to them. It's just a material. And of course, everything has a subjective value, and one man's treasure is another man's trash. But we all value the things that keep us alive, and the things that allow us to live our lives in a way that feel meaningful. And, there absolutely is the capacity in, whether it's blockchain or some other form of altcoins, that I don't want to say redistributes wealth, but cherishes real value and real wealth and makes it possible. That there is an opportunity there somewhere.
Yeah.
And maybe you and I don't know what exactly those rules are or that blueprint looks like right now.
The group of people who will participate, the movements that will be aided, but...
Right, and while there's of course a lot we could critique about altcoins or Bitcoin or NFTs right now, there is an avenue that is, shall we say, unowned right now. Mm-hmm. And so there are opportunities to steer civilization to a more socialist construct, and especially with what I imagine is going to happen in the next 20 years, 50 years with climate change. There will be opportunities and there will be major destabilization that cracks these opportunities wide open. And,
absolutely.
And I think as the left, we need to be ready to seize those opportunities, even if they're failures initially, to move us away from this, from the castration of capitalism, basically.
I wrote a poem a long time ago in an essay for this book, and it was called "The Crisis is Always a Peacetime," right? And all that I meant that was that in these moments when we have an opportunity for patience and thought, that's when we should be opposing the crisis that is oncoming. Because when the crisis comes, the organization will be brutal, right? Mm-hmm. So let's take this moment to think about how we can prepare for that, as other people pretend like it doesn't exist.
I couldn't think of a better thing to end it with. That was beautiful. So, thank you all for listening.
Thank you guys.
We'd love to hear what you guys think of crypto, of NFTs, of value. And so, hit that subscribe button. Please just give us your comments because that's fun. And
absolutely.
And we'll be back, in a few weeks with history of dialectics.
Yep.